Welcome to Voice of Russia's new political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Today, we have a look at the Eurozone, not only to criticize it, that's easy to do, but to consider what keeps the currency union together, meaning are there advantages to membership to this currency union? Also, we examine how Russians see the EU, particularly after the dramatic haircut imposed on Cypriot depositors. Okay, to hash this out, I'm joined by my guest in London, Ian Begg. He's a Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. We also have Henning-Meyer, Senior Visiting Fellow at LSE Government Department and editor of Social Europe Journal. And here in the studio with me in Moscow is Yaroslav LIssovolik. He's the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, Russia. Okay, Ian, if I can go to you first. We're all told that the currency union must stay together. This is an imperative because it's a positive. How is that?
Well, there's a number of things. First, there's a huge political investment in making it work. Second, the Germans like it. It suits them to have a large currency because they can then avoid the successive revaluations of the Deutschmark that used to occur and damage German exports. But third, I think we should recognize that it's part of completing a single market inside Europe, which enables trade to take place, exchanges of services to take place, and people to move freely. So it's all part of the construction of the European Union and seen as a vital part of that.
Okay, Henning, if I go to you, I want to go back to the Germans later. I was a little surprised it was brought up so quickly. But would you agree with it, what Ian just said? Because I think this is all theory. It all sounds very nice. I agree with every single word, but it's not working.
No, I mean, but what Ian said is absolutely correct. I mean, the original idea is why to have the same currency. I mean, reduction of transaction costs, transparencies in prices and wages and all of that. These are tangible benefits. Obviously, the construction was lopsided, and this is something that has to be corrected now.
Yaroslav?
Yeah, well, the construction was a bit lopsided. There were rules, economic policy rules, that were supposed to serve as the foundation for the union, and then it turned out that a lot of these rules were not observed. And I think what the European Union has to do to make it work is to go back to the roots and re-explore, rediscover the necessity, the importance of these economic rules, the rules that have to do with the level of the budget deficit, the level of debt, and also to look into what is sustainable for this union going forward. I mean, there's a theory in terms of economic theory, the theory of optimal currency zones and currency unions, and was this theory in accordance with what actually later on was put into practice? That's a big question mark because of what we saw in the past several years in terms of the euro crisis.
You mentioned there was a political imperative. Is that the most important imperative here?
It was and is, because keeping Europe together has been a long-term project ever since the Second World War to ensure peace and stability in the continent. And you have to say that that's succeeded. But what Yaroslav said is correct. The European currency area is not optimal in the sense that a one-size-fits-all policy can work for everybody all the time and be the ideal one. But then it isn't in the US either. If you look in any currency area, you see problems.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, even if you look at the UK, the interest rate you need for London is not the same one you need in Carlisle or other places. So obviously there is the theory of the optimum currency area, and Europe doesn't really fit it, also because of labor mobility issues, language barriers, and these sort of things. But we knew that beforehand, and we can actually manage this in terms of governance. But what I don't agree with Yaroslav is that, it's just the strict obedience to the Stability and Growth Pact or some fiscal rules will help the currency union to survive. I think this is just a lazy excuse for not having a proper system of governance. The Germans, as you know, were the first ones to break the Stability and Growth Pact, and not because we suddenly became profligate, because, the excuse is always, or the argument is always, that if you break any fiscal rules, that means suddenly you had a bout of being profligate spenders in government. In Germany, it was the cost of German reunification, which amounted to about 4% of GDP every year. So there were good reasons for Germany to run a larger fiscal deficit in these times. And just abandoning the flexibility of fiscal policy is not a substitute for having a proper economic governance system. It hasn't worked in the past. It will not work in the future, in my view. So this is just reinstating a kind of mistrust between different nation states, if you wish so. Because these rules only kick in later.
Okay, but big countries can get away with big economies. Okay, nobody's lecturing the Germans. Okay, but you can lecture, the Cypriots.
Well, I mean, part of the problem here, I think, is that the big countries have to lead by example. And to some degree, I would agree that if big countries do not observe fiscal rules or other rules of the European Union, obviously that sets an example for other countries. So what is important now is for these large countries to lead by example. To some degree, I think we do see that with Germany, and actually in terms of the countries that do observe the critical core of the rules in the European Union, Germany is certainly doing better than a lot of the periphery countries.
Well, Yaroslav, you could make the argument the Germans have benefited the most from the euro by a long shot.
Well, I think the Germans have certainly benefited. Also, you can say that with regard to the peripheral countries that experienced a tremendous reduction in their borrowing costs after the new countries of the European Union acceded to the Union. They also experienced a significant reduction in borrowing costs, and that was a tremendous boost to their economies.
That's how we got into this mess in the first place, Ian, isn't it?
In part because the way EMU was set up was flawed. And that's now been recognized. There's something called the Four Presidents Report, comprising the presidents of the European Parliament, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the European Council. And what they've decided is that you need to deepen the structures for the governance of EMU if you want it to function effectively. But that leads on to a bigger question, which is exactly why it was set up in the way it is in the first place. And the answer to that is that Europe is not the United States of Europe. It's an entity in which individual member states still have the dominant role in much of the policy making. And as a result of that, it's very hard to persuade the Germans that they should pay good money, good German taxpayers' money, to bail out what they regard as feckless Greeks, or even worse, Cypriots who've been milking the system by attracting deposits from Russian depositors and so on. So there is a difficult political economy in Europe in which you have to recognize the primacy of the states in what goes on. And that distinguishes it from much more closely federated entities like the United States or indeed Russia.
Mm-hmm. You might also say that there is at the core of the governance problems is a broken link between what I would consider responsibility and accountability. If you look back to the Cyprus issue and about the levy on the bank deposits, obviously if that was an idea that was coming out of Cyprus, it had repercussions or would have had repercussions across the Eurozone. Also in the case of Germany, apparently Germany was pushing, saying you have to bring in X amount of money yourselves. How you do it, that's down to you. But the way that's being done has repercussions not just for Cyprus and Germany, but also for the rest of the Eurozone. But in terms of accountability, obviously Angela Merkel is playing to the German electorate rather than any other electorate. It becomes very clear. So we have this sort of fractured system of governance where you have 17 different national decision-making procedures where accountability is rooted, but responsibility is wider than that.
Yes, and I would take that one step further. This is Ian here.
Go ahead, Ian.
I think the further step to take it is that we do need to recognize that countries like Cyprus benefited from their overinflated banking system. So it's very hard to persuade Germans that they should bail out somebody who was benefiting from the way the thing was set up in the first place. And let's not forget as well that although the headline news is about the Russian depositors and the other depositors in Cyprus having to pay part of the cost, the German taxpayer is still going to be offering Cyprus something like 3 billion euros as its share of the 10 billion euro European loan that's going to Cyprus. So the pain is being shared, and somebody has to bear part of that burden somewhere in the system.
But an interesting point about the Cyprus deal is also that I think two things were mixed up here. The one was the emergency measure to save the Cypriot banking system, and the other one was basically getting rid of a failed business model. This doesn't just apply to Cyprus. It raises questions about the business model of Luxembourg. It raises business model questions of places like Malta, and even the Netherlands has recently been in the news about how it allows companies to.
But with the difference, Henning, that in the case of Luxembourg, it's German depositors, not Russian depositors.
Well, that's a big difference.
But the point is, do you use this emergency situation? Do you use this emergency situation to get rid of a business model you don't like overnight, or would it be actually more sustainable? What I would consider to be more sustainable is you you solve the emergency and then set in motion a process that leads to a more sustainable business model later on. This will just generate political friction.
But this has to be a business model that is not only designed for the European Union itself. What we need is a global solution, because this whole issue of offshore centers, this is an issue that is actually well beyond the ramifications of the European Union itself. If you have the downfall of the Cypriotic model or the Cypriotic offshore, where does this money go to? To other offshores. But the whole model globally continues to operate, survive very well. So what you need is, of course, a very uniform approach that is taken with regard to all of these offshore centers in order for this not to create precedents that benefit one offshore center at the expense of the other.
This is the Voice of Russia, and you're listening to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. And if I go back to if you were to talk to a Spaniard or to a Greek, and they say, we need to get out of the Eurozone, what's your argument for them to stay?
Well, the first thing I'd say to them is that you're a very exceptional Spaniard or Greek, because most Spaniards and Greeks want to stay in, something that's often overlooked in this. The principal argument for staying in is the one of Pandora's box. When you open it, you don't know what comes out. We do know that if Greece were to leave the euro tomorrow, it would face a catastrophic devaluation, something like 50-60%, overnight inflation, a complete collapse of the Greek banking system, and I could go on, without a necessary solution being found from this in terms of improving its export sector.
How do you weigh it? Austerity for a generation or a dramatic drop in your economy over 5 years?
Well, they amount to the same thing, because what Greece needs to do is to create a viable export sector, which is what it lacks at present. It's being helped by its European Union partners. If it was cast aside, it would find it far, far more difficult.
Austerity for the duration is, in my opinion, the wrong approach anyway, whether you're staying within the Eurozone or whether you want to get out. The problem that we're having at the moment in the Eurozone is that we are pursuing not an asymmetrical deflationary adjustment within the Eurozone, and that's a big problem. So what was mentioned before, that Germany sticking to the rules and not expanding fiscally at the moment, is actually part of the problem of the adjustment within the Eurozone to rebalance it a bit. There is an interesting discussion going on, what kind of model is actually applicable. What is the Eurozone? Is it a country in the making, in which case imbalances should not matter that much? Do you care about the imbalances between Paris and the rest of France? Or is it what it is at the moment? 17 different nation states are bound together by the same currency, in which imbalances do matter. So I think the reality where we will end up is something in the middle. So we will have some sort of rebalancing between these member states. And we'll also have to have some sort of transfer mechanism, some permanent transfer mechanisms to counterbalance some of these imbalances as well.
Okay, well, gentlemen, this is all very theoretical, but where do the people fit in? I mean, there's a lot of pain out there, and that pain is going to continue for a long time. Yaroslav.
Well, I think this is a very difficult question. Obviously, where people fit in is in the electoral cycle, and they can express their views during the elections. And we saw on several occasions, including in Greece, when things really approached the cliff, and potentially Greece could have left the Eurozone. So it's important at this stage is that so far, despite all of the pressures that the European Union experienced, tremendous pressures, right, throughout several years in a row, the democratic process continues to work. And whatever the decisions that have been taken by Greece, by Italy, by other countries, they were all made by the populace in a democratic vote. And I think this is
we have a lot of technocratic governments as well.
Sure, okay. But that also means that it is not by any means completely cloudless going forward. That if austerity does persist and does bite into growth, as we continue to see, then.
Ian, can austerity create growth? Can austerity create growth?
Well, we're mixing up two things when we talk about austerity. One is fiscal policy retrenchment. It's what Greece has been forced to do because its fiscal policy was a disaster. But in Italy, austerity is really shorthand for going for the kinds of supply-side reforms which the Berlusconi governments over nearly 20 years had ducked. Reforms of the labour market, investing in research and development, the things that create long-term stable growth. The reason Italy's in trouble is slow growth. The reason it has slow growth is a failure to invest in the supply side of the economy sufficiently. So austerity is being labelled these two different ways. In fact, the fiscal retrenchment in Italy is pretty negligible. It's only a very slight correction, despite the fact that they have a high debt. So you need to look very carefully at the mix of policies in different countries and also at the reason these policies were implemented in the first place. Cyprus was a banking crisis. Greece was a public sector crisis. Portugal and Spain were partly banking, partly fiscal, partly competitiveness crises. You need different remedies for the different pathologies that have been in place. And the idea that there's all one model, the core doing one thing and the periphery doing another, is just geographical nonsense.
Henning, go ahead.
Yeah, well,
interesting point.
I think, in the short term you have to generate growth. None of these structural adjustments, I think, is possible in a situation where economies are shrinking to the extent they are shrinking now. Also, in terms of the democratic process, I mean, look at Italy at the moment. It's effectively ungovernable. So we have democratic repercussions of this system as well. But in terms of austerity, I mean, it seems to me very obvious, and the empirical evidence seems to be very obvious, that especially in the current circumstances where monetary policy is at its limits, where we can't do much more in terms of monetary policy, the fiscal multipliers, as they call it, the deflationary effect or the degrowth effect of fiscal retrenchment is much bigger than it would be otherwise. And that has been an unwise policy from the beginning, and it is really biting. And I think this is further undermining the actual capacity of the Eurozone to rebalance and come up with a more sensible governance system, because the democratic repercussions are also materializing. I think that's a wrong conclusion. If you see this five-star movement in Italy, the biggest party basically in an established country out of nowhere, this is a massive democratic shock.
If I may ask you the question on Ireland in that regard, which in my view is a very interesting case given the subject that we're discussing now. It is a country that seems to have succeeded more than other countries in the epicenter of the crisis in getting out of its difficulties, and currently it's exhibiting one of the highest growth rates in terms of productivity.
Why is that?
My view is that to some degree it's due to some of the policies designed to pursue structural reform. To some degree they have undertaken also measures to bring their budget into order. So several measures undertaken that really make Ireland an interesting outlier compared to some of the other countries that continue to be plagued by the crisis. So what is your opinion on whether that could be a role model for the rest of the countries in terms of getting out of the difficulty?
Ireland was one thing and one thing only: a major banking failure. The Irish banks had lent in a cavalier manner to the property sector. There was an asset bubble of a classical type that's been described over decades by economic historians. And what happened was that the Irish state then said, we guarantee the deposits. That meant all the difficulties in the banking sector were immediately transferred to the Irish state, which had to try to recover. Now, the real economy in Ireland, the productive sector of the economy, was already very efficient. Let's not forget, we have the Celtic tiger image from the previous decade. Ireland has succeeded in bringing in large amounts of foreign direct investment, has very competitive international companies, and is a platform for exporting to the rest of Europe. That does not describe Greece. Greece is an entirely different model. That's why I insist that we look at the different remedies for the different country.
Yeah, but that's interesting. I mean, can one currency take all of these things on board, deal with them? I mean, was this ever expected, ever planned?
Well, it was certainly never planned, but the idea of saying that there is a currency solution to this implies that by devaluing or revaluing your currency, you're going to make things better. And I don't think that applies to Greece. Greece is not going to be rescued by having a drachma that is 50% of the current price, because that's just another way of cutting real wages. Greece is struggling to cut real wages at present, but there is a major adjustment already going on. Unit labour costs, which is one measure economists use of this, show that between 2010 and this year, you can expect something equivalent to a devaluation relative to Germany of the Greek productive system of about 25%. Now, that takes time to feed through into export success, but it's happening. We neglect these changes at our peril.
Yeah, and that's also part of the problem, for instance, when you bring in Germany. I mean, Germany had wage restraint for about 15 years. So real wages did not increase in line with real productivity gains. So this is what I mentioned before in terms of a symmetric versus an asymmetric adjustment. You know, if you adjust in Germany upwards as well, that will also help to ease some of the pressure for some of the other countries. And there's not also also the argument that this will then globally make the Eurozone less competitive, that again can be then rectified by devaluing the euro if necessary.
But Henning, there's a difficulty here, which is the solution is clear: get the Germans to spend more. How do you persuade the Germans to do it?
Well, first of all, you need higher wages in Germany. So the suggestion
is... But how do you persuade the German system to grant higher wages? They don't want to vote for it.
Yeah,
that's
I think it's a difficult...
That's changing.
That's a difficult enterprise because the tradition in Germany has always been to keep inflation low, and that's the culture that has been bred throughout decades. So I think this is something that, while popular in other countries in Germany, there is significant conservatism around this issue.
Henning, go ahead, John.
Well, there is some conservatism around this issue, but there's no common sense or commonly accepted, for instance, in Germany, that you need some form of minimum wage. There are differences between the current government and the opposition parties currently in an election campaign. But the situation that you could still have hairdressers in Eastern Germany working for €3 an hour, that's created some outrage in Germany, and rightly so. So creating for the first time a legal minimum wage, that's the one thing. And also, if you look at, obviously in Germany we have the social partnership that determines the wage structures. If you look at that system and the recent results of this, there were also above inflation increases in wages. So broadly speaking, this is moving into the right direction. How do you get the Germans to spend? Well, if you earn more money, you're more likely to spend more. If you don't earn more money, you won't. What Germans won't do, and that might be a mentality issue, won't go into consumptive debt in order to prop up spending. That might be
good.
Difference.
I'm glad the word was mentioned, debt, because this is what I want to talk about now. Ian, is this a currency going to be associated with debt for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
Well, there are different categories of debt. There's public sector debt, which is being addressed, albeit extremely slowly. The natural response in a severe recession is to allow public debt to go up. It's happened in the US, it's happened in the UK, it's happened in the euro area. So there's nothing distinctive about the euro area's trajectory in this regard. Private sector debt is much higher in the US and in the UK than it is in the euro area, except for selected countries like Spain. So there's a worldwide need for deleveraging of debt, which is occurring and which is bearing on all the economic systems. So it's not just the euro area which is subject to this problem. I think the whole Western economy, and I'd even include Japan in strange definition of Western, is subject to this need for deleveraging. So it will bear on the global economy for a long time.
But can we get growth at the same time while paying off our debts?
Well, I mean, we all
do both at the same time.
Yeah, but we all agree. I mean, debt is a problem, and we need deleveraging. We disagree sometimes about the way how to achieve it. I think the way if you look at how were the big debt mountains decreased previously was through growth, right? If your GDP grows faster than your debt burden, you automatically lower your debt to GDP ratio, which is the measure that is used for sustainability. If you do the opposite, what we seem to be doing at the moment, if you impose austerity policies that are very likely to decrease your GDP faster than your debt, you end up with higher debt to GDP ratios. So turning this mechanism around, I think, is key to solving the debt issue in the long run.
You're listening to Voice of Russia, the program Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle.
But the problem for the European Union at this stage is stability. If you place too much emphasis on growth and not enough emphasis on stability, the problem of debt, your debt yields, and how the market views you is going to be exacerbated. It's a very fine balance, I think. But going forward, my view is that the pile of debt will make it very difficult for the European Union to grow and to compete in terms of growth rates with other regions, which is leading some of the countries like Russia, for example, to look into reorienting their growth trajectories away from Europe towards the faster growing parts of the world, like Asia, for example. So that has been one of the trends that Russia has been pursuing, trying to increase its share of trade with places like China, with other faster growing economies in Asia, given the fact that most likely in the next decade or so, the growth rates in Europe are likely to be quite low.
Yes, and I think in this regard, the negative model we have globally is Japan, which has had essentially 2 decades of stagnation.
2 lost decades.
Well, yes. How lost were they, we don't know, because Japan is also an aging society, and the demographic factor has been quite significant in what's happened in Japan. Japan is not in pain, but it has very high public debt. and yet it runs a surplus vis-a-vis the rest of the world on its trade accounts. So it's a curious model of just gradual decline rather than dramatic change. And that may be the benchmark for some parts of Europe. Yet, on the other hand, we see Germany recovering. Germany is increasing its share of global markets, again, having lost them in the previous decade. And if you look at the governance reforms that are taking place in Europe, they are, piece by piece, putting together the jigsaw puzzle of a new economic model, a new governance model in particular. We don't yet know whether it's going to be as effective as its architects hope. But I think there is at least some reason now for optimism that the European leaders get it. They understand the nature of the problem, and they're trying to deal with it.
I try to be optimistic, but I don't see the systematic approach that Ian has identified yet. If you look at the history of crisis policy over recent years, it seems to me that it's always been too little, too late, and it's piecemeal, and the pieces don't add up to a systemic reform in my view. But Japan is also an interesting case because obviously even though they have this massive debt to GDP ratio, yields have remained very low because of the age structure, partially because there is a savings situation in Japan that you don't have in other societies. So it's not as simple as just saying if you increase in the short term your debt level, that automatically will increase your yields. It's I think a bit more complicated.
Henning, we're almost running out of time.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question. How do the angst the Germans feel about how other Europeans feel about them in this crisis? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that most Germans don't know the nature of the crisis. They think this is something to do with profligate spending all over in the south, and that they're being made somehow to pay for laziness in other European countries. This is a very complex crisis, but it's never been explained properly to the German population. That's one of the biggest criticisms I have to the current German government.
You mean by the political elite?
Yes, by the political elite, also not by the press hasn't done a great job either. So,
well, indeed, the press has done the opposite. The most popular newspaper in Germany, Bild Zeitung, consistently
absolutely
excoriates the Greeks for their fecklessness, and that feeds into German public opinion. So what you have going on in Europe is two-level games within countries to try to get the country's position, and games between countries to try to resolve it, and maybe even a third level between institutions, with the European Central Bank doing the one thing and expecting the member states to do the other. It's a complicated arrangement.
It is. I mean, as it stands, Germany is the biggest winner. There is no
exactly.
As it's the euro has remained competitive. German refinancing yields have been pushed down because capital was moving into Germany. So if it all stays on track, Germany will be a big winner. But that's not the feeling what the people have, and Ian is absolutely right.
We're out of time here. I hope if Germany's a winner, all of Europe can be a winner. Many thanks to my guests today, Ian, Henning, and Yaroslav here in the studio with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And you were listening to Debating Russia on Voice of Russia.